What's up, everybody? It's me, Johnny. UFC 303 has barely finished. It's Monday morning Australian time. Yet we have some new official fight announcements which are set to take place at UFC 305 in Perth, Australia on the 17th of August US time or the 18th of August Australian time. And we need to talk about them. The card is starting to take shape. I still think we need one or two new big fights in there to really round it out. But still, if you're an Aussie or a Kiwi UFC or MMA fan, I still think this card has a lot of fun, exciting fights in there. Maybe not to the caliber of other recent UFC big events, but still something fun for us fans in Australia and also New Zealand. I'm trying my best to make it to UFC 305 in Perth, Australia. It's just not the easiest trip. It's literally on the other side of the country. So what I'm in fact trying to do is get official UFC press credentials to go there, interview fighters, be part of the post-fight press conferences especially, and stuff like that. It would be awesome to be able to do that. It would certainly justify the trip all the way to Perth, Australia. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I can get those press credentials. And if I'm there, Rob's going to be there. Maybe we can create video content for the channel for MMArcade in person. That would be sick. Let's see what happens, but in the meantime, let's talk about the card for UFC 305 in Perth, Australia. Of course, we already knew what the main event is. It's Drickus du Plessis against Israel Adesanya for the middleweight title. This was already announced as the marquee event. It makes sense. I know a lot of people don't want to see Israel in there for the title. But even though he lost against Sean Strickland, he didn't defend his title after regathering it after beating Alex Pereira. Still, he was a very active middleweight champion. He was a very dominant middleweight champion. He's Kiwi. It's not exactly Australian, but there's still a bit of a connection there. He's fought in Australia before. It still makes sense. I know people want to see Sean Strickland in there. And Sean Strickland, mind you, is very popular for some reason in Australia. So whether it was Sean or Israel, I wouldn't have cared. I just understand why this fight is coming together. The more obvious location would have been South Africa or somewhere in Africa, given the connection with these two fighters and the beef that they've had, specifically about Africa. But if it wasn't going to be in Africa, because the UFC, I don't believe, has ever held an event there, the next best location was obviously Australia. And I believe this fight is bigger because they haven't fought before and because these two fighters have such a beef with each other. So it makes sense. I think it's going to be a fun fight. But now we know some of the other fights that are going to be taking place at this card. We got a flyweight bout. KaraFrance, who of course is Kiwi, against Steve Erceg, who is the Aussie. This fight is a banger. This is probably going to be the co-main, I believe. I don't think they've announced it yet as the co-main. All of these announcements didn't come through the UFC. They came through Aussie and Kiwi media. That's typically what the UFC does, especially in Australia. They'll let the media feed out these fight announcements so they get a bit of clicks and build a bit of hype for this fight. Especially because, or for this event, especially because it's a local event. So that's how they do it. Eventually, I think this week, the UFC will announce them on their channels. However, KaraFrance against Steve Erceg, this is going to be a banger of a fight. Cannot wait to see this one. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. KaraFrance, of course, is coming off 2 losses against Amir Albazi. That was a split decision loss, and against Brandon Moreno. KaraFrance needs a win. This is going to be a very common theme with this card, by the way. A lot of Aussies and Kiwis in there, as you would expect, but a lot of them are coming off a loss or two. So it's a consistent theme. So keep that in mind as we talk about the rest of these. Steve Erceg coming off a loss against Pantoja for the title. Now, many people believe that Steve Erceg won that fight. I want to believe that he did, but I need to rewatch the fight because if Steve Erceg didn't try and grapple in that last round, he would have won, all right? But because he did that, it just wasn't the best look, and I can understand why the fighters or the judges gave Pantoja the win. Regardless, it was still a very close fight. He did fantastically well. I really do believe that Steve Erceg is going to be a champion one day. He is so good with his hands. His boxing, his striking is phenomenal. That guy has real power in his hands. And if it was anyone in there aside from Pantoja, they would have been knocked out in that fight. It's just because Pantoja has a granite chin. He doesn't ever get knocked out. He goes in with reckless abandon. He was taking so many shots from Steve Erceg, and he was still going in there. He's so resilient, that dude. I can't believe it. But Erceg still has very good hands. It's a Kiwi versus an Aussie, so there's a bit of competitiveness there. We have a bit of a rivalry with New Zealand, of course, us in Australia. So this is going to be great. Both do need a win. However, it's kind of sad because I don't want to see either lose, right? I don't want to see KaraFrance lose, and I don't want to see Steve Erceg lose. If Steve Erceg loses, that really puts him right down on the rankings. Like, when is he ever going to see a title opportunity again? I don't know. Equally, if KaraFrance loses, that's certainly not good for him either because he's coming off of 2 losses. So that would mean 3 losses in a row for him. That's also not a good look. I like Kai. I like Steve Erceg. I don't want to see either of them lose. But one of them has to lose, and it's going to be a fun fight. So if I was to give an early prediction, probably I'm leaning towards Steve Erceg. But we'll talk about it with Rob in a podcast episode. Possibly tomorrow or Wednesday. Let's see what happens. But that fight is going to be great. I think it's a perfect fight to make as well, given it's taking place in Australia. Next up, we have a heavyweight bout. Tuivasa, who of course is Aussie, against Rozenstruik. Now, Tuivasa is coming off losses against Tybura, Volkov, Pavlovich, and Garn. Rozenstruik is coming off a win against Gaziev. However you pronounce that name, I believe it's Gaziev. But before that, he obviously lost to Jailton Almeida. Now, this is going to be a fun fight. I think we already knew about this as well because Tuivasa posted about it on his social media channels. And he was like, thank God, because it's not a wrestler, right? Tuivasa does not do good against wrestlers. Like obviously what happened against Tybura and Volkov, right? He needs to be in there with a striker, someone else is just willing to stand there and bang. And Rozenstruik is that guy. This is going to be a very fun fight. No wrestling involved. Someone's going to get knocked out. And it's going to be great to see Tuivasa in Australia fighting. So I cannot wait to see this one, but I don't know who wins. It's 10th ranked Tai against 12th ranked Rozenstruik. Again, Rozenstruik is coming off the win. He has a bit of momentum. Tai has a few losses strung together. It's a hard one to call. My head is telling me that Rozenstruik is going to win, but my heart wants Tuivasa to win. Hopefully he can get the job done. Let's see what happens there. And then we have a women's flyweight bout. Casey O'Neill, who's a Scottish Aussie, against Teresa Bleda. I'm not too familiar with these fighters, so O'Neill is coming off losses against Lipsky and Meyer. Bleda is coming off a win against Gabriela Fernandez. Again, I'm not too familiar. I'm going to have to research these fighters, especially Casey O'Neill, before we do our official predictions in the podcast. And then we have another heavyweight bout, Junior Tuffer, Aussie, against Volta Walker. Now, Junior Tuffer is coming off a pretty brutal loss against Marcos Rogerio de Lima. That fight was hard to watch, man. He just got battered with kicks from memory. And then Walker is also coming off a loss as well. It would be nice to see Junior Tuffer get the win here, especially because of what happened with his brother and they replaced each other in each other's fights. That was insane. Those two are badasses. I don't know if the other Tuffer is going to be fighting in this card. It would be nice to see that. We'll talk about that in a second. But seeing Junior Tuffer in there is great. Hopefully he can bounce back after that loss. I think he does have a future in the UFC. I don't think he's ever going to be like a champion. Like maybe he can slowly reach to top 5, but I think he can realistically get to top 10 at the very least. But that heavyweight division has some killers in there. He needs to fight a lot more. He needs to get more experience, but let's see what happens. Hopefully Tuffer gets the knockout. That's going to be my early prediction. Then we have a featherweight bout. Again, another Aussie, Josh Culibao against Ricardo Ramos. Josh is coming off losses. Again, a lot of losses here. Josh is coming off losses against Danny Silva and Lerone Murphy. Ramos is coming off losses against Julian Arosa and Jourdain as well. So again, I'm not too familiar with Ricardo Ramos. I need to look up this fight a bit more, do my research. But it's good to see Josh Culibao and Aussie in there. This card is just filled with Aussies. And I'm going to be talking about this later. But just because the card is taking place in Australia, not every fight needs to be an Australian. Like, as much as I love it, not every fight needs to have an Australian in it. Not every fight needs to have a Kiwi in it. And all that's doing is like limiting the potential of the card. Like, we can still have non-Aussies fight in this card and it'd still be fun. We are UFC fans first and foremost. We are Australians, of course, and we are Kiwis, but we just want to see fun fights, right? So let's see what happens. We got a featherweight bout as well. Sorry, it's a bit cold here. Jack Jenkins, the Aussie, against Gavin Tucker. Jenkins is coming off a loss against Jose Mariscal, but that was an arm injury, a TKO. Gavin Tucker is coming off losses against Diego Lopez and Dan Ige. Speak of the Devils, they both just fought at UFC 303. And then we have a lightweight bout, Tom Nolan, who's an Aussie, against Alex Reyes. Nolan is coming off a win against Victor Martinez, a loss against Nicholas Motta, and Reyes is coming off a loss against Charlie Campbell. So that is the card so far, and they are definitely still planning new fight announcements. So if you remember back when Dana White accidentally leaked this card, he did a video, and in the background in the war room, you could see half of the list of fighters that they were planning for UFC 305. I still think they're set to announce more fights for this card. So I don't think this is it, because as it stands, sure, this card would be fun for Aussies. It would be fun for Kiwis to watch in person, especially. The main and the co-main, if that KaraFrance and Steve Erceg fight is the co-main, I think having that as the co-main and the main event, that's set for a really fun main card at least. So I would still be happy with this if I was paying tickets for tickets and I was heading over there, right? But I still do think objectively it needs at least one big fight in there, if not two. So let's try and think what other fights could be in there, what other fights are rumored, what other fighters that appeared on that leaked list from Dana White. So we have Jacob Malkoon potentially could fight. If you don't know, that is actually Rob's teammate. Jacob Malkoon, Aussie, makes a lot of sense for him to be in there. I think a couple of names are being rumored for him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was announced for this card. That's not like a big fight. Jacob Malkoon is still relatively experienced, but it would be good to see him in this card and fight in Australia. But here's a big one. Dan Hooker against Drakkar Klose. I think they are trying to organize this fight. I believe it was Drakkar Klose that appeared on that leaked list from Dana White. Dan Hooker being a Kiwi makes a lot of sense. I would love to see this fight in there. Another rumored fight, and this doesn't involve any Aussies, and this is what I was talking about. Song Yudong against Henry Cejudo. I would love to see this fight, right? I would love to see this fight at UFC 305. It doesn't make sense from the perspective that any of them or either of them are Aussie, but still, it's going to be a fun, good fight, and it has a lot of implications for that division, right? Song Yudong, Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo really needs a win. Yudong needs a win as well. It would just be great to see these two fight at UFC 305 in Perth, Australia. Again, I love the fact that they're trying to cram as many Aussie and Kiwi fighters into this card, but they don't all need to be Australian, right? As much as I would love that, they don't all need to be Australian. Look at the main event. Even though Israel is Kiwi, neither of them are Australian, but you still have that as the main event. So I would like to see Song Yudong against Henry Cejudo. It makes a lot of sense. Now, we keep seeing Jack Della Madalena's name being thrown around. I know that, I think he and Shavkat Rakhmonov want to fight against each other, and they were trying to organize it. Again, it appeared on Dana White's leaked list. However, Jack Della Maddalena is injured, so I don't think he's going to be able to fight at UFC 305, which is a shame. He would be great to include in there. I'd be very happy with that if he was fighting and Song Yudong against Henry Cejudo and also Dan Hooker. That would be for an amazing card, but I think Jack Della Maddalena is injured. I also think Justin Tuffer is still injured as well, but at least we've got his brother in there, so that's fine. Alexander Volkanovski, I don't think he's going to fight. Now, he was willing to step in on short notice to save the Conor McGregor and the Michael Chandler card. So, could Volk fight at UFC 305? It's in Australia, his home country, not his hometown, but his home country. It depends. He said that he's already been promised the fight against Ilia Topuria, right? So it doesn't make sense for him to fight. He still needs time to recover. I think the UFC wants him to recover. We don't want a repeat of the last couple of fights. But if maybe he was moving up in weight and there was a willing fighter, you can have Volk fight. But also as well, I don't know, do you really want Volk to be fighting on as a co-main? He is a main event fighter. I would like to see Volk fight Ilia Topuria, but he still needs a bit of time to rest. So I don't believe that Volk is going to be fighting, especially because he hasn't really indicated that he will be fighting at UFC 305. So I don't think he's going to be fighting. And also Rob said that he's not going to be fighting. He's taking time off to spend time with his family. It's a shame to not see Rob fight in Australia. He keeps missing those dates. However, it makes sense. Rob's probably not going to be fighting. He also said that he doesn't want to be the backup fighter for the main event, which I completely understand. Being a backup fighter is a bit of a nothing anyways. Usually the fight takes place anyways. And we've seen sometimes backup fighters not actually be the backup. What was it? It was Volk against against Islam Makhachev. Who was the backup fighter for that fight and never actually became the backup? Volk was just put in right in there. I'm going to think of the name eventually. Someone let me know in the comments below. So I understand that. Though if Rob was the backup fighter and for some reason Izzy had to pull out, Rob would easily slot in there. He'd slot in there even if he wasn't the backup fighter. I still think they would call Rob first as opposed to Sean Strickland because Rob literally lives in Australia. So if something did happen to Izzy, right, and Rob officially wasn't the backup fighter, I still think the UFC would call him. But At this time, Rob said he isn't fighting. He doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to be the backup fighter. So we aren't going to be seeing him at UFC 305 in Perth, Australia. So I would like to see some more fights announced for the card, but still it will be fun. I'm trying my best to make it. Hopefully I can get those press credentials. UFC, if you're watching this, let me come. I've got all the equipment. Rob and I can make content in person. I can interview fighters. I can ask some good questions at the post-fight press conference and all that kind of stuff. It would be sick. I would love it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, this has been Johnny. Please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. It was Gamrot. Machu's Gamrot was meant to be the backup fighter. He was meant to slot in against Islam Makhachev, and then Volk was called up, and Volk was in. I just remembered before I stopped recording. I didn't Google it. I swear to God, it was Gamrot. Anyways, take care, guys.